88 team that worked with us on this. I won't go through their names, but their names will be added to the list later. Treaty 8 Chiefs, thank you very much for showing your support. Uh, you know, when we did this research there, I approached Grand Chief Noski and his way back when to begin this work. We had to do some of this work with the elders and their guiding ceremonies that Mike Beaver and Dusty Twin and Roddy Twin performed for us over at the site when we started this work. Today's announcement is painful. It's fortunate that so many of us can be together today. Together we are always stronger. The work completed is just a tip of the iceberg and the beginning of uncovering our truth. June 2021, I reached out to Grand Chief Noski. We knew there was much work to be done, not only for the children, but for the ones who have passed on and did not make it to see this day. The day affirmations were made about the atrocities that they knew about and carried themselves for many years. There was a meeting held in Enoch at the end of June, where I had the opportunity to reach out to all the chiefs and survivors to share our research we had to date. It was then I was appointed lead of the RRS Task Force Committee. Our first gathering in Kapawe'no was in August. Due to all the testimonies that we were getting, it was decided that the best approach would be in research phases. I would like to acknowledge the late Cecil Belrose and his wife. It all started with him when he reached out to me after the Kamloops story broke, and the grief was that was being felt. He came to me and shared his story as he was working in the area of decommissioning of the buildings. They come across a body, and he talked to the priest about it, and they were told to be quiet about it, and must have weighed heavy within him. So that's one of the stories he shared with us as we go forward. The reason that I say that is I want to pay a special homage to him at our next gathering. It's people like him that tell their stories that is so painful. And those stories are being borne out as we move forward. Phase 1 was conducted. We are here today to talk about those results. Before that, it is important to recognize that more work is required. We will be doing a phase 2 and 3 to further analyze and conduct the rest of the research of other lands as per the testimony and such. Finding one grave is too much. Finding multi is incomprehensible. My thoughts, prayers go out to the families whose loved ones never made it home and who died at the hands of these so-called schools. 169 anomalies were found, with some higher confidence than others, some within the cemetery, some outside of the cemetery. But more work needs to be done. And this was only in 1 acre of that vast site. So 2 methods were used at that time. We had the ground penetrating radar and as well as a drone. Dr. Kisa will talk about that more. Yeah. Research and technology will be employed going forward. Whatever we have to do to actually find what is in there in those findings. This marks a long journey ahead of us on hopes to find answers who never made it home from the same. Once we do that, we can start our journey of healing, rebuilding our identities that they fought so hard to take from us. The grief we felt when discovering our stolen children has opened fresh wounds. We remember the desolation of our people felt when our children were forcibly removed from their families, communities, to be placed in Indian residential schools. I would like to honor all the elders, survivors, who bravely shared their truth with us, truths that were not believed or acknowledged for many, many years. We are forever grateful for their forced sacrifice and courage. These findings that we're talking about today validated their lived experiences and are important on our long healing journey. Our little warriors have waited to find them, and now we will ensure they rest in peace. Now, we recognize the results of surveys for unmarked graves may be distressing for most, as every child matters, and there remain also in the area where Treaty 8 was signed. So it really boggles your mind, how this can happen when all those people were around in that era and in that time frame. Even today, when we talk about some of this stuff, we talk about the 60 scoop. That happened by the same governmental powers that were in play at that time. Even today, we face those atrocities as Native people as we move forward within our own structures. So with that, we'll be reaching out to the families listed. You can register with Treaty 8 or at my office at Kapawe'no. So take care. Again, thank you for being here. I'll turn it over to Dr. Kisa to talk about some of the technical stuff.
Hi, thank you, Chief Castro. Hello, I'm Dr. Keisha Supernant, Director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology at the University of Alberta, and I'm here today to present the technical results of the ground search around the residential school site in Burrard, Alberta. The Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology was invited to partner with Kapawe'no First Nation as they began conducting investigations to find the locations of unmarked graves of children who passed away while attending the residential school. After an initial community gathering and technical assessment, a 3-phased project plan was developed to conduct ground survey work at locations near the St. Bernard Residential School at Burrard Mission and other future locations. The first phase focused on high-priority areas identified by survivors, community members, and in archival records. Phase 1 ground searching, including ground-penetrating radar and drone imagery, was conducted in October of 2021 by a team from the IPIA. Here I am providing a summary of the process and the findings from Phase 1. Before discussing the results of the survey, I wish to make a few comments. First, we do not need ground penetrating radar results to know that children didn't come home from this school. The knowledge of survivors and the extensive archival records already contain clear information about children dying while in residence here. The use of ground penetrating radar and related techniques are being used to try to identify where these children are buried, including those who may not be in those records. Second, it is important to recognize that ground penetrating radar is a geophysical technique that identifies changes in the physical properties of the soil and is therefore not a foolproof method of detecting unmarked graves. A negative result from a GPR survey does not mean that there are no graves in a particular location. It only means that further analysis or study is needed to confirm, especially if survivor testimony, oral history, or archival research suggests otherwise. In addition, the discovery of anomalies requires careful expert analysis to determine the likelihood of these positive results representing unmarked graves. As mentioned by Chief Halcrow, we searched nearly 1 acre of land around the St. Bernard's Indian Residential School over 6 days, using the Canadian Archaeological Association's established best practices for single-channel ground penetrating radar data collection when searching for unmarked graves. The GPR survey was conducted in 4 general areas separated into 15 individual grids. The GPR worked differently across the 15 grids, with some grids providing very clear results and others somewhat less reliable results. In addition, we collected imagery using drones to provide a clear map and additional data for the area. All of the data were analyzed to look for anomalies containing traits associated in the scientific literature with unmarked graves. Anomalies consistent with other buried features such as tree roots, building footprints, rodent burrows, pipes, and gravel roads were eliminated, and the remaining anomalies were assessed by multiple analysts. As Chief Halcrow noted, 169 potential graves were identified based on analysis of anomalies within the GPR data that had characteristics associated with unmarked graves. Of these, 115 were found inside the existing community cemetery in areas with no grave markers. Due to the combination of these being inside the cemetery and some corresponding surface indications such as depressions, we can be reasonably confident that these most likely represent graves, but we cannot determine which of these may be the graves of children and which might be the graves of other members of the community. Parish records indicate children who are recorded as having died at the school were buried in the community cemetery. But as these potential graves are not currently marked and no plot maps have been located, we do not know who was buried in a specific location within the cemetery. 54 potential graves were located in other areas around the school property. While these anomalies are outside of the cemetery, they share characteristics with those within the cemetery. The potential graves in locations outside of the cemetery are currently unaccounted for in the records, but they match knowledge of survivors, including Cecil Belrose. All of these locations will warrant further investigation. The preliminary results from Phase 1 mark the beginning of a long journey to find answers. We used site-specific information provided by Kapawe'no First Nation and obtained through background research to develop these areas of high priority. And as a reminder, we've only covered about 1 acre of land. There are very large other areas left to search. The interpretation of GPR data presented here only applies to the sites currently that have been investigated and is a summary of key findings. In addition, ground penetrating radar is only one geophysical technique and not the only way to look below the surface. We recommend that additional techniques be applied, especially to build our confidence in the possibility of these locations being those unmarked graves. At the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology, we appreciate the support of Kapawe'no First Nation, especially Chief Halcrow and the Treaty 8 team. We're grateful to the elders who conducted ceremony to help us do the work in a good way. We also want to thank survivors and community members who visited with us while we were conducting our painful work and shared with us their knowledge. We also recognize these results will be painful and distressing for many, especially for survivors and community members. Every child matters. One grave is too many around a school. These children died far often from their families. As someone whose family members are in the records of the children who died at the school, I feel the pain of loss of those who should have been my aunties and uncles. Each of these children was a beloved part of a family, and no one has been held accountable for their deaths. The preliminary results of phase 1 indicate there's much more to do to find answers and bring the children home. Hi, hi.
Thank you and welcome. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge the chiefs for their support and the staff. Chief Halcrow for the work that's been done and taking the lead on this. And also I'd like to acknowledge Rick Gilbert from Williams Lake First Nation that did their announcement just recently in January of the anomalies that were at their residential school site. Again, good afternoon, and I am Arthur Noski. I sit as the Grand Chief of Treaty 8. I am originally from Loon River First Nation. I am honored to be a part of this, in going forward. Today marks an important day. Today, our people will take another step on the long path of emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual healing and restoring our nation's spiritual well-being. As you have heard, Dr. Kisa and her team have discovered 169 anomalies that have traits associated with grave sites. This means there are 169 potential remains of Indigenous children left behind. 169 children who never made it home to their parents, grandparents, and community. As survivors of the residential school system, we're aware of the abuse and crime children endured at these institutions. Now, with ground-penetrating radar technology, the rest of the world can see the truth we've always known. These are not schools. These were not schools. They were institutions established to kill the Indian in the child. And as the number of children found in graves continues to climb, we see it was never about erasing who we are, but eradicating us altogether, genocide. When I think of those children, I feel a deep sorrow that I am not sure I can put into words. It's as if this wound cannot heal. It's reopened over and over. And when you think it will get better, it splits open again. Every day, nations and communities across this land continue to find more of our ancestors' remains. How can we heal? If we haven't found them all, how can we heal? Unless we search every single residential school site in Canada for our children. Imagine sending your child to school one day, only to never see them again. When you inquire, you are refused an explanation as to where your child is or if they are even alive. Imagine your child is missing after being sent to school. No one is looking for them, and no one seems to be bothered to care. How would you cope? What would you do? Our children have gone missing, murdered only now, more than 100 years ago. 100 years later, we are beginning to understand what truly happened to them. And yet, there are many more children who will never be found, never receiving the explanation or closure we yearn for. While it's difficult to put into words how painful this work is, we will continue until every residential school site is searched for the graves of our people. We won't be able to truly move forward in our healing. We need to inform and educate the world so this does not happen again. Truth must come before reconciliation can begin. I hope the children we have found can now rest, knowing we have found them. It brings great comfort knowing they are now in the presence of God. With that, I pray for our people, for those directly impacted by this announcement today. Communities across provinces had relatives attend this school. It is not an isolated incident to Kapawe'no or the Gruard area. Children were gathered from near and far to attend this institution. With that, again, I would like to thank Chief Halcrow in taking the lead and the lessons learned in the strategic process of how to engage in going forward with the search of the other sites. This was only a part of, 2 schools. There's 2 more parts to follow. And I would like to thank the churches, the bishops, for working with Chief Halcrow in providing the names that are posted on that wall. And we ask for ongoing cooperation from not only the churches, the bishops across Canada, but also with the municipalities, private landowners, and towns for where these searches have to happen. And we ask for your assistance that this would be an unhindered process for us to bring closure to this horrific history of our people. I would like to say also, back in those days, there were people being recruited from the residential schools to go to war. My uncle was one of them. To put down the atrocities overseas. And only those atrocities were happening in our backyard without the world knowing. And I know this information is very hard to, deal with at times without anger arising. But I ask for cooler heads to prevail. We have survivors listening and knowing that these wounds again are reopened. And I want to remind the survivors that there are resources available through the Indian Residential School Crisis, and it's at 1-866-925-4419. Please reach out if you are struggling. We will get through this together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We're now going to take some questions from media in the room, and then we'll go to online questions. Yeah, go ahead. You can use the mic right here. Just please state your name, your outlet, and then who your question is directed to. Thank you.
Hi, it's Carly Robinson with the News Edmonton. I'm not sure who would want to take this question, but just on that oral history component and the confirmation that this is for so many who have been sharing their stories. If you can just talk a little bit more about where these stories were told and how you hope to keep them moving forward with this report.
Thank you for the question. The role of the testimony of survivors and the history that they've carried is really essential to this work. It directs a lot of what we do. There was, thousands and thousands of hours at the TRC of witnesses coming forward, survivors coming forward and sharing their testimony. And this continues with the work around unmarked graves. In my experience, having done this work in a number of different locations, survivors, oral history is always backed up by the science. And like I said, it shouldn't be required for survivors to be believed. They've been telling their truth. Even during the residential school era, there were things brought forward. But now we can support that truth with these additional methods.
I can take a stab at that as well. I know I have 3 uncles and 2 aunties that were in the residential school system. And one of my uncles used to question, about babies crying. And he said, babies cry because they're hungry they're scared, they're cold, or they're hurting. And he used to hear babies cry. He went to St. Bernard Residential School. And all of a sudden he said, then there'd be no babies crying. The question he took to his grave was, where were those babies? What happened to them? And again, I thank the church for relinquishing the names of those children. And in those death certificates are basically the time of birth and death on those line items. There was one that said 15 minutes. There were some that are 2 months, 3 months, 5 months, and 8 months. So the question that used to arise was, well, where did those babies come from? And like the survivors talked about the abuse, the sexual abuse in those schools. I'm pretty sure at the time that there was nobody that can take a 15-minute-old baby and be able to transport them to the residential school. So they were being born in those schools. So again, this information is it's heavy, it's hard, heavy information, I'll say. But our elders always had the integrity to speak the truth. And now we're seeing, what's been neglected all these years coming to the surface.
And just to follow up on those records being released, I mean, this shows that all along there was a list, in a sense, or if you can clarify a bit on those records being released and what it means to have that out now.
So I can speak to the records that are being referred to here. What these represent are a list of children who died, recorded as having died in the parish. And we extracted the names from a much larger list of everyone who had died in the parish, focusing on the years the school was open and school-aged children. So the list that was being referred to is a list of school-aged children who passed in the parish or in the parish records. And we have not yet done a full confirmation that every single one of them was in residence, but I think we can make a reasonable assumption that Indigenous children of school age, while the school was open, were at a residential school. So that's what those records are being referred to.
Tansy, it's Brianna from Global News in Edmonton. Doctor, I'm wondering if you can speak to phase 2 and 3, now that phase 1 is wrapped up, what that will look like and what it will include.
I can speak a bit to that, and I'll also invite Chief Halcrow. So we had, when we first developed the 3-phase plan, the idea was to start with areas identified as high priority to get the work started. Phase 2 will involve a continued research into the archival records, continued work with survivors and oral histories, and further ground searching, both at the St. Bernard School, but there's also the Anglican School of St. Peter's nearby that also requires a significant amount of searching and investigation. And as I mentioned, 1 acre of what is a very large area, and so there are additional areas that need to be narrowed down to target for ground penetrating radar and other technologies. There may also be some follow-up on the areas we've already searched to bring in another method just to add to our knowledge there.
Yeah, also, as we go forward with this, the other areas that have to be searched, it's really interesting in that area. There's so much history of that area. When you look at it, the Gruard was, I guess you would say, was scheduled to become an Edmonton, the capital of Alberta, so to speak. When you go back into that era, there's so many people that were in there. You don't have a barracks for the police put into a place where there's not a town. Same thing with the Indian agents that were there. They were off from the site. They had big colonial buildings where they were living in. So some of those sites is where we got to do some of the search as well as we move forward. You know, this story is so vast, and you know, when I first come across it, my council said, you know, here's some money. Let's put some money together and start this work. When the elders came to us with their stories, and I said, okay, if we do this, then we got to approach the different organizations. So the first report that we're talking about was paid for by Kapawe'no First Nations, you know, to conduct it and get it done. You know, later on, the funding sources that the provincial and the federal government may make available, we just got the provincial funds maybe a couple weeks ago. Federal funds are still coming in the mail somewhere, I think. I'm not totally sure, but I think they are. But that's the way they treat us, you know. If we could have waited, this report wouldn't have been done until probably next year, or however long it would have taken us to get it done. We didn't want to wait. We wanted to, because of the stories that we were told by the elders and the survivors, we said, no, we're going to go ahead for it, and we've done that. You know, I feel that we did carry out what was given to us as a task to get this here, and today we're speaking about it. So as Dr. Kisa and the Grand Chief talk about, there's so much work to be done yet and to continue to go down this road. There is other 11 areas within Treaty 8 that should be conducted as well within their own First Nations. Some of them are on the reserve, some are off. So as we go forward, I'm hoping that some of the work we've done can become kind of like a blueprint on how to do it as they move forward. They could use our documentation. They could use some of the data that we gathered to help them achieve their processes as they move forward. And one of the things that really disturbed me was that the communication people from the provincial and federal government coming forward and calling this a project. You know, just because our tribal council applied for some money on a later fact to help us with this search. You know, the province made some money available, so we as a tribal council got together and said we'll apply for it, and we did. And they, you know, they come back. Their people are calling it a project. It's not a project. It's a discovery of truth of what happened in that area. You know, this is really important to now know, because this first report was paid for Kapawe'no just to get away from that type of scrutiny. Now that they give us money to do that, does that mean they're going to censor our reports? You know, this is always a danger when you talk with the provincial and federal governments for monies that they make available. So I want to make sure that does not happen. This should never be censored by anybody. It should be shared with everybody. Those are my final comments on this, and I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Thank you.
Doctor, can I just ask you quickly, you mentioned your personal link to this school. I don't know how comfortable you feel, it's up to you, but can you speak a little bit about that and who you lost?
Yes, so one of the things that has been part of this process for me is my family. So I'm a Métis, and my family has long connections to this area. My great-great-grandfather was born in Gruard, and my Chapan, my great-grandfather, was born nearby. And when we're going through, for example, this list of names, there are many of my family's surnames, including the version of Supernant, which is my last name. And I know that a number of these folks would have been related to me directly. And this was part of my discovery in this work. I didn't know that ahead of time because my dad was a victim of the 60s scoop and taken from his mother at birth here in Edmonton. And I have had to spend a lot of my adult life reconnecting. And this work is really hard, but really important to me as a relative, but also as someone who is very committed to using the best possible scientific methods, being very true to the data we can collect in this process. And I just feel humbled to be able to bring both of those things to this work.
there no more questions from reporters in the room? Okay, we're going to go to online questions. We have a question coming in from Amber Gosling of the Western Standard. Her question is directed to Grand Chief Noski. So Amber, you have to unmute your mic and then you're able to speak and we'll be able to hear you. So please go ahead. Just repeating, Amber Gosling of the Western Standard. If you have a question for Grand Chief Noski, you can now go ahead. You just need to unmute your mic.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
It's Amber Goslin with the Western. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chief, for taking my question. So in light of this evidence, do you plan on doing an actual excavation of the site, as there hasn't been a body found at any of these other locations across the country?
I believe it's not in our culture to exhume bodies. And I think that as we go through the research and searching all the other sites and for confirmation, if that's what the public, I guess, needs, right? Maybe the elders will consider it, but we usually go through our elders in asking for that guidance. And like I said, culturally, we've never exhumed dead bodies. So that's probably a decision that will have to be made in the future.
I wonder if I might also just make a comment.
Thank you.
The results of this include 115 anomalies inside of a cemetery. I don't think we need to exhume areas in the cemetery to prove that there's likely to be graves there. I think that can be an area of great confidence. I also will continue to support Kapawe'no and other Treaty 8 nations to look at other non-invasive methods of supporting the interpretation of these as graves. This can include the use of other methods to confirm without having to necessarily exhume. And I think it should definitely be in the hands of the nations to make that decision about what they actually do.
I guess, and further to that, I know I'm not sure if Chief Adam's online, but Chief Adam was in the residential school at Fort Chip, ACFN. And they closed that residential school in 1976, I believe. And why did they close it? Basically, through recess time, when the kids get to go play, back in those days, like it's in the bush in the hills. So kids started sewing up with bones, sewing the bones to the teachers, which were human remains being found on those hills as the kids were playing. That was at a residential school site. So we have those history. We have those, the knowledge keepers that have that history. And I will say that, the rest of society, well, I believe do their darndest to undermine the findings of Treaty 8 residential schools. There were 11 in Treaty 8 territory alone. Canada's information is there's over 150,000 kids across Canada that attended these schools. And many of them never made it home. So I know that there's people out there that'll try and contradict information or, to undermine this process. And I understand if it's something that really targets your religion. But in saying that, first and foremost, it's for our people, to bring closure for our people. And then we can go to the Imperial Crown and talk about reparations after that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Grand Chief. I'm going to keep the opportunity to ask questions open for another few seconds here if I get any messages online. But if not, I'll just take this opportunity to say a copy of the report, the interim report, has been made available at the Kapawe'no website. It's kapawe'no.com. And there's actually an 18-minute video of the ground penetrating search is now available at treaty8.ca. So I've put that in the chat for the people who are watching online. And then for the people in the room, the media in the room, it's kapawe'no.com and treaty8.ca. And it looks like that's the only questions we have online. So I would like to thank everybody for coming. This is a very important day. We want to ask all the chiefs to please join the panel at the front, and we're going to have a picture showing your solidarity with this movement.
Jay, can I just make one quick note?
Please.
What is posted on the Kapawe'no is a summary of the report. It is not the complete report that has been submitted. It is a summary of that report.
Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, so you can now take your place at the front, and then we'll have some photos.
Jay, there's a question.
Oh, there's one question from Bill Forte, CTV News. Yeah. Bill, we're going to put you on. Go ahead. You can ask your question.
Yeah, you can hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. This is for Chief Halcrow. I've been cutting in and out of reception, so forgive me if this has been asked, but I'm wondering about specifically the potential unmarked graves found within the cemetery. I'm looking for, what do you expect that means? Like, are we potentially talking about human beings, children who are, buried in the cemetery without ceremony, without marker? Like, is that what you believe is the case there?
Yeah, I didn't fully hear your question there, but when we started this whole process, when we had our gathering, we had a ceremony by our elders over at the site, as well as where the graveyard was. We did that. A lot of that with our elders that were conducting our ceremonies. So we did it with to bring peace to the people that were buried in that area, no matter where it was, just so that we pay homage to them.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Thank you for your question. I believe that's all the questions we have online. So we will continue with this photo opportunity, and then I'll be shutting down the online Zoom. So thank you to everyone who has joined us online. We appreciate your interest and your questions.